The day the sky opened and fire fell, Lyra was in the garden collecting moonflowers. She had woken before the sun rose, as was her habit, to pick the flowers while they still held the silver glow of starlight. Her hands moved gently over the delicate petals, careful not to bruise them when a sound rolled across the horizon like distant thunder. It was a sound that did not belong to Eloria. It was not the call of a bird or the breaking of distant storm clouds. It was something mechanical and alive and terrifying all at once. Soren and Mira felt it before Lyra did. The two dragons, who had been sleeping in the tall grass nearby, suddenly lifted their heads. Their scales, which usually shimmered with peaceful blue and green light, began to glow brighter with agitation. The bond they shared with Lyra suddenly felt tense, like a rope pulled tight. Through their connection, Lyra felt their fear and their curiosity mixed together in a way that made her own heart race. She straightened up, the moonflowers forgotten in her hands, and looked toward the north where the sound had come from. The sky above the distant mountains was changing. Where there should have been only blue and white clouds, something else was appearing. A shape. A massive, impossible shape that fell slowly through the air, leaving a trail of white smoke and orange fire behind it. The ship was beautiful and terrible at the same time. Its body was made of some kind of metal that caught the light and threw it back at the world in sharp, bright flashes. Wings, if they could be called wings, extended from its sides. But they did not move like any bird's wings. They adjusted and shifted, working with the wind and against it, slowing the ship's descent. Lyra had read about things like this in the ancient texts her mother kept hidden in the stone room beneath their home. She had read about the times before, when the first elves came to Eloria and found it empty of other intelligent life. She had read about the prophecies that spoke of visitors who would come from the stars. She had never truly believed those texts were anything more than stories. Lyra called to the dragons through the bond, and they came running. Their feet barely touched the ground as they raced toward her. Soren was larger, his scales a deep blue that reminded Lyra of the ocean in the ancient stories. Mira was smaller and faster, her scales shifting between shades of green and silver as she moved. Together they were a sight that would have made most humans run away screaming. But Lyra was not most elves, and she did not run. Instead, she ran toward the landing site. The journey from the garden to where the ship finally came to rest took an hour of running through the forest. By the time Lyra reached the meadow where the ship had crashed or landed, or whatever it was the machine was doing, the sun had moved higher in the sky. She stood at the edge of the clearing, hidden behind the ancient oak trees, watching. The ship had settled into the green grass without actually damaging very much of it. That struck Lyra as important somehow. A falling piece of sky could have destroyed everything in this meadow, but it had not. The pilot or pilots had skill and control. This was not an attack. This was an arrival. Panels on the side of the ship began to open slowly and deliberately. Lyra could see light coming from inside. Artificial light, nothing like the sun or stars or even the controlled fires that the elf mages could create. This light was cold and white and filled with purpose. Then figures began to emerge. They came out carefully, one by one, moving slowly down a ramp that extended from the ship's side. Lyra counted 5 of them. 5 beings made of a substance that was not stone or clay or any of the materials that elves use to build things. Their skin was soft-looking and exposed to the air, and they moved with joints that bent in ways that seemed both stronger and weaker than elf bodies. But it was their faces that made Lyra hold her breath. They were not monstrous or evil. They were simply different. Different in the way that a fox is different from a deer, or the way that water is different from stone. They had eyes that moved in similar ways to elf eyes, but the shapes were varied. Some had hair that was light-colored, and others had hair that was dark. One of them, the one who seemed to be leading the group, was a woman with hair like dried wheat, and a body that showed strength and confidence in how she stood. This was the woman named Holly, though Lyra did not know that yet. Holly took a few steps away from the ship and looked around at the world of Eloria. Her face showed wonder and caution in equal measure. She gestured to the others to stay close, and then she began to move across the meadow. Lyra noticed that Holly moved like a hunter moves, carefully aware of surroundings, checking for dangers, but not moving with the kind of aggression that meant she was planning to attack. Soren and Mira pressed against Lyra through the bond, their emotions chaotic. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something like recognition. It was strange. Lyra had never felt anything like this in the dragons before. It was as if some ancient part of their dragon nature remembered these humans, or remembered beings like them from a time long before Lyra was born. Lyra made a decision in that moment that would change everything. She stepped out from behind the oak trees. The effect was immediate. The humans stopped moving. Holly's hand went to something at her waist, a tool or possibly a weapon, but she did not pull it out. Instead, she simply stood very still and watched Lyra approach. Behind Lyra, the dragons emerged from the forest. When they saw the full size of Soren and Mira, the humans made sounds of shock and fear. 3 of them actually backed up several steps, moving closer to the ship, but Holly did not move. She stood her ground and watched as Lyra walked closer. Lyra had never spoken to a human before. No living elf had. The humans were creatures of legend, things from the old times, beings who had supposedly stayed on their homeworld and never ventured out among the stars. But here one was, standing in a meadow on Aloria, looking at Lyra with eyes that showed intelligence and courage and fear all mixed together. Holly held up her hands, slowly and carefully. Both hands came up, showing empty palms. There was no weapon visible. There was no threat in her posture. Holly simply held her hands open and waited. Lyra understood what Holly was trying to communicate. She understood because understanding between species, it turned out, did not require words or the same kind of voice. It required intention and honesty and a willingness to see another being as more than just a potential danger. Lyra slowed her approach and stopped several paces away from Holly. The dragon stopped too, and they sat down in the grass. The gesture of sitting down was their own offering of peace. A dragon standing was powerful and potentially threatening. A dragon sitting was no threat at all. Holly's face changed. The tight caution that had been there began to shift into something else. Something that looked like relief and wonder and excitement all at once. She smiled, and the expression transformed her face completely. She suddenly looked much younger and much kinder than she had when she first stepped out of the ship. Through the bond, Lyra felt Soren and Mira relax slightly. Whatever ancient memory they had stirred at the sight of humans, it was not telling them to be afraid anymore. Lyra pointed to herself and spoke her name in the elf language, which was full of sounds that humans probably could not make. It did not matter. Holly listened carefully, and then she pointed to herself and spoke her own name in a language that was harsh and angular and completely different. Holly. It was a simple name, but it fit her somehow. The other humans began to walk closer now, seeing that Holly was not in danger. They approached slowly, and Lyra noticed their eyes kept returning to Soren and Mira. They were afraid of the dragons, but they were also fascinated. One of them, a man with dark hair and the kind of face that showed he was always thinking, brought out a device that looked like it was made of the same metal as the ship. He held it up carefully and pointed it at the dragons, not like a weapon, but like something used for gathering information. Holly looked at Lyra and made a gesture that said she wanted to sit down. Lyra nodded, and both of them lowered themselves to the grass. This was how the first real conversation between elf and human began, in a meadow on Aloria, with 2 dragons watching over them, and the sky overhead holding all the mysteries of space and possibility that neither species had fully explored yet. The first words exchanged between Holly and Lyra came not from speech but from observation. Holly pointed to the moonflowers that Lyra had dropped earlier in the garden, which were still visible in the distance, and made a gesture that suggested they were beautiful. Lyra understood this completely. She had spent so many hours among those flowers, learning their patterns, understanding when they bloomed and when they faded. She nodded and made a gesture back that said, yes, they are beautiful, and that this place was worth protecting. Holly smiled again, and this time it was a smile that held genuine warmth. She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out something that Lyra had never seen before. It was a smooth, thin object made of material that was neither wood nor stone nor metal. Holly held it out carefully to show Lyra, and images began to appear on its surface. At first, Lyra flinched, thinking it might be some kind of magic, but when nothing happened to hurt her, she leaned forward to look more closely. The images showed a world covered in blue water and green land with white clouds and the kind of sun that looked different from Aloria's sun. Holly pointed to this image and then pointed to herself, making it clear that this was her homeworld. This was Earth. Holly then held up the device differently and new images appeared. These showed the ship that had landed in the meadow, but it was shown from the outside, drifting through darkness through space itself. Holly pointed to the ship and then to the empty sky above, making clear the journey it had taken. Lyra understood now. These humans had traveled from another world entirely. They had crossed the void between stars and arrived here on Aloria, which Lyra had always thought was the center of everything. It was a thought that made her feel both small and amazed at the same time. One of the other humans, the woman that Lyra would later learn was named Sophia, approached very slowly and carefully. She was holding another device, this one smaller, and she made a questioning sound. Holly nodded to her, and then Sophia pointed the device at Soren. The dragon made a sound of irritation but did not move. Sophia watched the device carefully, reading numbers and symbols that appeared on its screen. Her eyes widened slightly. She said something in her harsh human language, and Holly's eyes widened too. Lyra felt through the bond that Soren was nervous but not afraid. Whatever this device was, it was only gathering information. It was not harmful. Sophia slowly approached Soren and held out her hand, showing that it was empty. Slowly, very slowly, she reached out and touched the top of Soren's head. The dragon's scales were warm, and the touch made Soren's light glow a little brighter. Sophia made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been an expression of wonder. It was hard to tell. Grant, the man with the thinking face, brought out more devices and spent time scanning everything around him. He scanned the trees, the grass, the flowers, and eventually he brought out what looked like a tool. He knelt down in the grass and looked at the soil, scooping some of it up in his hands and letting it fall back to the ground. He looked thoughtful. He turned to Holly and spoke in his human language, and Lyra could hear concern in his voice, though she understood not a single word. Holly gestured for Lyra to follow her, and together they walked across the meadow toward where the ship rested. The other humans stayed behind, continuing their observations of everything around them. Holly pointed to the ship and made gestures that suggested something was broken or not working correctly. She pointed to various parts of the ship's exterior and shook her head in a way that meant no. This is not right, this is damaged. As they walked, Holly pulled out the image device again and showed Lyra more pictures. These pictures showed the ship functioning properly, with lights that were brighter and technology that seemed to work better. Then new pictures appeared showing damage, showing parts of the ship that were scorched or broken. Holly pointed to a large section on the ship's side where metal had warped and twisted from heat. She pointed to it and then pointed to the sky, making a gesture that suggested something had happened during their arrival in the world. Lyra understood. The ship had been damaged coming through something in the sky. An atmosphere, perhaps, or some kind of barrier that Lyra did not fully understand. Holly made a gesture that suggested the ship needed materials to repair itself. She pointed to the ground, then to the mountains in the distance, then back to the ship. She was asking for help finding something that could fix her vessel. Through the bond with the dragons, Lyra felt a pulse of recognition. Soren and Mira knew something. Deep in their ancient dragon memories, they held knowledge of materials and stones and things that could conduct power or energy in ways that normal materials could not. In the mountains, in the deep caves beneath the Singing Mountains, such materials existed. The old text that Lyra's mother kept had spoken of them, though she had never fully understood what they were used for. Lyra pointed to herself, then to Holly, then to the mountains. She nodded firmly, a gesture that meant, yes, I will help you. Holly's face showed such pure relief and gratitude that Lyra felt something warm bloom in her chest. This human woman, this stranger from another world, was trusting her to help them survive in a world that was completely foreign to them. Grant and the others were called over, and through a combination of images shown on the device and gestures that were becoming more and more detailed and understandable, Holly explained that they would be making a journey into the mountains. The journey would take time. The journey would be difficult, but they would need to go. Derek and Nina, the two pilots, looked at each other with expressions that showed worry. They knew the ship better than anyone, and they understood what Holly was asking. They would be leaving their vessel, their home, their safe place. They would be going into an unknown world with an unknown species, but Holly's confidence seemed to calm them. If Holly believed this was the right choice, then they would follow her. That night, the humans set up a camp at the edge of the meadow. They brought equipment out of the ship, things that made sense for traveling and surviving. Lyra watched them work, impressed by their efficiency and organization. They did not waste movements or energy. Every action had a purpose. Holly approached Lyra and the dragons as darkness was falling and the stars were beginning to appear. She pointed to the stars and then made a sweeping gesture across the sky. She pointed to herself and then made a gesture that suggested travel, movement, going. She was showing Lyra where she had come from, showing her that humans too were creatures who looked at the stars and wondered about what was out there. Lyra looked at Holly's face in the starlight and saw something that she recognized. She saw the same longing that Lyra herself had felt her entire life, the same desire to understand, to explore, to see what lay beyond the familiar. In that moment, Lyra realized that differences between species might be less important than similarities between individuals. Soren and Mira curled up beside Lyra as she sat near the humans' campfire, and through their bond, she felt their peaceful acceptance of what was to come. Tomorrow they would begin a journey that would change everything. But tonight they would rest and tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. The dragons seemed perfectly content with that arrangement, and so was Lyra. The journey to the Singing Mountains began at dawn. Lyra woke to find that Holly had already been awake for some time, making careful observations of the landscape. The human woman was looking at a device that seemed to display information about direction and location, and she was comparing it to drawings that were printed on thin material. Lyra realized that Holly was studying the land, learning it, trying to understand it before they traveled through it. This impressed Lyra greatly. Too many travelers, she knew, rushed forward without really seeing the places they moved through. The group made good time through the forest. Grant had developed a carrying system using materials from the ship, and he and Derek took turns carrying supplies that would have otherwise been too heavy for the others to manage. Nina moved at Holly's side, keeping watch for any dangers that might emerge from the forest. Sophia walked between Lyra and the dragons, and through her behavior, Lyra could see that Sophia was becoming fascinated by Soren and Mira. The healer would often approach one of them and place her hand on their scales, checking something with the device she carried, and then making sounds of satisfaction or interest. By the middle of the first day, Lyra could see that the humans were struggling with the terrain. Their bodies were adapted to different gravity and different environments. The air on Aloria was thinner than the air they had evolved to breathe, and their muscles were working harder to move through the forest. Holly noticed that Lyra had observed this, and she made a gesture that asked if the pace was acceptable. Lyra slowed down and Holly seemed relieved. They stopped to rest in the afternoon at a clearing beside a stream. Lyra showed the humans how to filter water so that it would be safe to drink. She showed them plants that were edible and plants that should be avoided. With each piece of knowledge she shared, she saw Holly watching, learning, remembering. This woman was not just traveling through Aloria. She was beginning to understand it. As they sat by the stream, Grant pulled out his devices and began to make calculations. He looked at Lyra and made a gesture that she recognized as curiosity. He pointed to the mountains in the distance and then to his device. He seemed to be asking about the distance and the difficulty of the journey ahead. Lyra tried to explain using gestures and sounds that it would take at least 2 more days to reach the caves, and that the terrain would become more difficult as they climbed higher. Holly listened to this information and then made a decision. She gathered the group together and explained something in her human language. Though Lyra could not understand the words, she could understand the meaning. Holly was saying that they would continue forward, that the difficulty was acceptable, that they would manage. Her confidence in her ability to lead them through this challenge was clear and steady. That evening, as darkness fell, they reached the foothills of the Singing Mountains. The air had become cooler, and Lyra could hear the sound that gave the mountains their name. When the wind moved through certain rock formations, it created tones and music that seemed almost alive. The humans stood still and listened, and Lyra could see wonder on all of their faces. Even beings from another world could recognize beauty when they encountered it. They made camp in a sheltered area between 2 large rock formations. Grant worked to set up equipment that would keep them warm through the night. Sophia worked to make sure everyone had eaten and rested properly. But Holly spent time sitting with Lyra and the dragons looking up at the sky. The stars here were different from the stars on Earth, Holly explained through gestures. She pointed to different areas of the sky and made names for them. She was pointing out constellations, patterns that humans had recognized from their homeworld, and patterns that existed only here on Aloria. As Lyra listened to Holly explain the stars, she began to understand something profound. Humans, for all that they had evolved on a different world, for all that their bodies and minds worked differently from elves, they shared the same desire to look at the universe and find meaning in it. They saw patterns where there were patterns. They told stories about the lights in the sky. They wondered about their place in the vast cosmos. Through the bond with the dragons, Lyra felt Soren and Mira's agreement with this thought. Whatever differences existed between species, curiosity and wonder seemed to be universal. They seemed to be the things that made sentient beings recognize each other as kindred spirits. On the second day of traveling through the mountains, they began to move more carefully. The paths became narrower and the heights became greater. Lyra could sense the humans' fear of falling, though they did not voice it. They moved with careful deliberation, keeping their feet secure on the stone paths. Holly never rushed, never pushed too hard. She seemed to understand that fear was not a weakness but a reasonable response to danger, and she treated it with respect. By late afternoon, they could see the entrance to the caves ahead. The opening was dark and vast, carved into the side of the mountain thousands of years ago. Lyra could feel the ancient power emanating from this place. It was not evil, but it was strong and old and something that demanded respect. Through her bond with the dragons, she felt their reactions. They were tense, alert, as if they could sense something stirring in the darkness. Lyra turned to Holly and made a gesture that said, "We must stop here for now. We must rest." Holly nodded in understanding and gestured for the group to make camp. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of orange and red, Lyra sat with Holly and explained something through gestures and sounds. The cave was not dangerous in the way that predators or falling rocks were dangerous, but it was protected. There were old magics, ancient powers that had been set to guard what was inside. Holly seemed to understand the importance of this warning. She did not immediately rush into the cave demanding answers. Instead, she sat with Lyra and the dragons, and she seemed to be preparing herself mentally for what was to come. She checked her equipment. She spoke with her crew, making sure everyone understood that caution and respect would be needed. As darkness fell completely, Lyra found herself sitting beside Holly, watching the stars emerge above them. The human woman seemed peaceful despite the challenges ahead. She reached over and placed her hand on Lyra's shoulder in a gesture of companionship and trust. Through this touch, Lyra felt something. A bond was beginning to form. Not like the bond she shared with the dragons, but something similar. Something that meant these two individuals from completely different worlds were beginning to trust each other with their lives. Tomorrow, they would face whatever lay inside the cave. But tonight they were simply two travelers, one elf and one human, sitting together under stars and mountains, understanding each other without words. The morning of the third day arrived with a stillness that made everything feel suspended and waiting. Lyra woke early before the sun had risen above the eastern mountains, and she found Holly already awake and moving quietly among the camp. The human woman was checking supplies, testing equipment, and preparing for the moment when they would enter the cave. She worked with a focused intensity that Lyra recognized. Holly was afraid, but she was moving forward anyway. This was true courage. Lyra approached Holly and made a gesture that meant "We will go in together." Holly nodded and placed both her hands over her heart in a gesture of gratitude and agreement. She called the others to wake, and soon the group was eating a quick breakfast and preparing their equipment. Grant worked carefully to adjust lights that would help them see in the darkness ahead. Sophia made sure everyone drank enough water. Derek and Nina checked every part of their gear multiple times, like pilots checking a ship before a difficult flight. As the sun crested the mountains and began to illuminate the cave entrance, Lyra stood before the opening with Soren and Mira. The dragons were restless, their scales flickering between different colors, showing their uncertainty and caution. But when Lyra looked at them through the bond and showed them her intention to move forward, they settled. They would follow her as they always did. Lyra closed her eyes and reached out with her mind toward the barrier that protected the cave. This was not a physical wall or a locked door. This was magic, ancient and powerful, put in place by the elves who had sealed these caves long ago. The barrier existed to keep out thieves, destroyers, those who would take the sacred materials for purposes of greed or violence. But it was also designed to recognize certain things, certain presences that carried understanding and respect. As Lyra's mind touched the barrier, She felt it recognize her as an elf. Recognition but not welcome. The barrier was ancient and stubborn, and it had been in place so long that it had developed its own will about who should and should not be allowed inside. But then something extraordinary happened. As Soren and Mira stepped closer to Lyra, their dragon essence touched the barrier at the same moment that Lyra's mind did. And the barrier suddenly shifted. It was not exactly a memory, but it was like a memory. Lyra felt the barrier recall other dragons, ancient dragons from ages past, dragons who had helped the elves seal these caves during a time when danger threatened Eloria from beyond the stars. The barrier recognized the dragons not as invaders but as allies, and if dragons stood with an elf, then the barrier began to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, the barrier's work was not needed against these travelers. Holly was watching Lyra with intensity, trying to understand what was happening. Through gestures and the emotions flowing through her face, Lyra tried to communicate what was occurring. The cave is recognizing us. The cave is deciding to let us pass. Holly nodded slowly, and Lyra could see understanding in her eyes. Holly seemed to grasp that they were not forcing their way into this place, but instead asking permission from something ancient and powerful. The barrier dissolved like morning mist. It did not happen all at once, but gradually, like a door opening very slowly. The darkness inside the cave began to recede, not because there was light, but because the darkness became less absolute. It became a space that things could exist in, rather than a void that prevented existence. Grant's lights blazed to life, and suddenly the interior of the cave was revealed. The walls glowed with crystals, thousands and thousands of crystals jutting from every surface like stars had been captured and embedded in stone. The light that came from them was soft and multicolored, shifting between blues and greens and purples and reds. It was the most beautiful thing that the humans had ever seen. Lyra could read this in their faces. Even Grant, who carried scientific instruments and thought in terms of data and measurements, simply stood still and stared. Holly recovered first. She moved forward into the cave slowly, respectfully, and gestured for the others to follow. Derek and Nina came next, then Sophia, then Grant. The pilots were moving like warriors entering a sacred space, which in a way they were. Lyra and the dragons came last, and as the group moved deeper into the cave, Lyra could feel the ancient magic here, all around them, watching them, evaluating them. Grant began to work almost immediately. He brought out his scanning devices and moved slowly through the cave, taking readings and measurements. The crystals were everything he needed. They contained energy signatures that would power the ship for years, possibly decades. He looked at Holly with an expression of triumph and relief. This cave held the solution they needed to survive, to return home if they had to, or to continue exploring if they chose to. But then something changed. The air itself seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and a sound echoed through the cave that was not the wind or the movement of the group. It was a sound that came from deeper within, from the places where the cave extended into the mountain far beyond where human eyes could see. The Guardians were waking. They emerged from the darkness like stone given life. They were not dragons, though they had some similarities. They were creatures of the ancient world, made from the bedrock of Eloria, creatures that had been placed here thousands of years ago to guard this sacred space forever. Their eyes glowed with the same light as the crystals around them, and their forms shifted and changed as they moved, as if they were not entirely solid, as if they existed between dimensions. The humans froze. Fear flooded through Grant, through Sophia, through Derek and Nina. They had carried weapons aboard their ship, but those weapons were useless against beings of pure magical power. Holly understood this immediately. She also understood what needed to be done. She stepped forward, placing herself between her crew and the Guardians, and she did something that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. She spoke. Holly's human voice echoed through the cave, harsh and angular and completely alien to this place. She spoke in her human language, knowing full well that the Guardians would not understand the words. But Holly was not trying to communicate information. She was trying to communicate intention. She spoke of the need to repair a ship and return home. She spoke of cooperation between different species. She spoke of respect for this sacred place and for the Guardians who had protected it for so long. As Holly spoke, Lyra felt something happening through her bond with the dragons. Soren and Mira were responding to the Guardians in a way that was ancient and instinctive. They were not challenging the Guardians, but acknowledging them. Dragon to Guardian, kindred spirits separated by age but united by purpose. The Guardians slowed their advance. Their glowing eyes focused on the dragons, and a communication seemed to pass between them, something that had no words but held great meaning. Lyra understood that this was a conversation between beings of magic, a discussion that transcended language and species. Holly continued to speak, and her courage seemed to shift something in the Guardians' ancient minds. They had been set to guard. But perhaps, Lyra thought, perhaps they had been set to guard until a time came when something worthy of the cave's treasures arrived. And perhaps the cave itself, through its ancient memory, was telling them that this time had come. The Guardians did not retreat, but they also did not advance. They simply stood there watching as Grant carefully collected samples of the crystals. The work would take time, but it would be done unmolested. The Guardians had made their decision. The work inside the cave took an entire day. Grant moved carefully among the crystals, collecting only what was needed, never taking more than the cave could afford to lose. Sophia stayed with him, documenting everything they found, making notes about the properties of the crystals and how they seemed to respond to being handled. Derek and Nina worked on creating containers that would safely hold the materials they collected. The Guardians never moved. They simply watched, like ancient sentries honoring a truce. Lyra sat with Holly during the work, and through the long hours, they developed a language of their own. It was not made of words, but of gestures and expressions, and the kind of understanding that grows when two people spend time in close proximity and genuinely try to understand each other. Holly showed Lyra more images on her device. She showed pictures of the ship before it was damaged, pictures of Earth, pictures of other worlds that humans had visited and documented. She showed pictures of human children and human families, of cities and oceans and deserts that existed on a world so far away that it was almost impossible to comprehend the distance. In return, Lyra tried to show Holly what Eloria meant to her. She used gestures to show the seasons changing, the way the forests grew and the way the animals moved through them. She showed Holly how the elves lived, not in great cities but in harmony with the natural world, taking only what they needed, preserving what was precious. She showed Holly the garden where she had been when the ship first arrived, and through her descriptions, Holly seemed to see it clearly in her mind. By the time the sun was beginning to set on the first day inside the cave, Grant had collected a substantial amount of the crystal material. He showed Holly his calculations, pointing to numbers on his device, showing that the ship could be repaired with just this amount, but that they should collect more if time allowed. Holly agreed, and they decided to spend one more night in the cave and continue the work in the morning. That night was strange and beautiful all at once. The humans slept fitfully, still somewhat unsettled by the presence of the Guardians. But Grant seemed energized, excited by the scientific discovery he was making. Sophia worked through the night, making careful observations about the crystal properties. Derek and Nina sat together and spoke in low voices about what would happen next, about whether they would return to Earth or continue exploring this strange new world. Lyra did not sleep. Instead, she sat with Soren and Mira and felt the rhythm of the cave itself, the ancient heartbeat of the mountain and the magic that flowed through it. She thought about Holly and her crew, about these humans who had come from so far away and shown such courage and respect. She thought about how different they were, but also how similar. They wanted the same things that all beings wanted. They wanted to survive, to understand their place in the universe, to create meaning from their experiences. Through the bond she shared with the dragons, she felt their ancient knowledge flowing. Soren and Mira had experienced so many lifetimes through the accumulated memories of dragons, and they seemed to be telling Lyra something important. They seemed to be saying that when two beings, no matter how different, met with courage and respect, it created something new. It created the possibility of change. It created the possibility of something better. By morning, the collection work was complete. Grant and his team had gathered enough crystal material to not only repair the ship, but to have surplus for experiments and study. As they prepared to leave the cave, Grant approached the Guardians and did something that struck Lyra as incredibly brave. He simply bowed, a gesture of respect and gratitude. Holly saw this and did the same thing. Her crew followed, And then Lyra and the dragons bowed as well, honoring the guardians who had allowed them to pass. The guardians' eyes seemed to brighten for a moment as if they were pleased by this display of respect. And as the group moved back toward the cave entrance, Lyra felt the barrier reactivating behind them, sealing the cave once more, protecting its remaining treasures for future generations. The journey back down the mountain was faster than the journey up had been, but it was also more somber. Everyone understood that they were approaching a moment when things would change. The humans had what they needed to repair their ship and return home. The question was whether they would return home, or whether something else might happen. When they reached the meadow where the ship rested, the damage was still visible on its exterior. But Grant and his team moved with purpose and efficiency, beginning the work of repair. It took hours of careful work, removing damaged panels, installing new components and running tests to ensure that everything was functioning correctly. As the sun began to set on the day of their return, the ship's lights flared to life. The repair was complete. The ship was no longer stranded on Aloria. It could fly. It could escape. It could return to the stars. Holly called everyone together. Her crew gathered around her, and she gestured for Lyra and the dragons to come as well. Through expressions and gestures, Holly conveyed something important. She was giving her crew a choice. They could return to Earth now, taking their discoveries back to their people. Or they could stay longer on Aloria, explore more and gather more knowledge. The choice would be theirs. Grant and Sophia looked at each other and nodded. Derek and Nina did the same. And then they all looked at Holly. Through their expressions and body language, they conveyed their decision. They would stay. They wanted to explore more, to learn more, to understand this world and its people better. Holly's face showed relief and joy. She turned to Lyra and made a gesture that was unmistakable. She was asking if Lyra and the dragons would stay with them. She was asking if they could continue this partnership, this cooperation between their peoples. Lyra did not hesitate. She stepped forward and placed her hand on Holly's shoulder in the way that humans did. And then, she placed her forehead against Holly's forehead in the way that elves did. The gesture combined both of their traditions and created something new, something that belonged to both of them equally. Through the bond with the dragons, Lyra felt their joy and their excitement. They had found something rare and precious. They had found beings from another world who respected them, who valued them, who saw them not as curiosities or threats but as equals. As night fell over Aloria, Holly and Lyra sat together on a hillside overlooking the ship. Holly showed Lyra the stars again, and this time, when she pointed to distant lights, Lyra understood what she was showing. She was showing Lyra her home, but she was also showing her the future. A future where humans and elves and dragons worked together, where different worlds could connect and share knowledge and cooperation. Soren and Mira sat on either side of them, their scales glowing softly in the darkness. And above them the stars wheeled through the sky, witnesses to the beginning of something extraordinary. The humans had charged their starship on Aloria, but in doing so, they had also charged themselves with a new purpose. They were no longer simply explorers from a distant world. They had become something more. They had become the bridge between worlds, the beginning of a new era where cooperation could transcend the vast distances between stars.